Welcome to Decision Space, the only show that takes place right here, in the space between the turns of your favorite games. I'm Pete Wissinger,
I'm Cole Wehrle.
and this is the podcast about decisions in games. And as longtime listeners can tell from that introduction, it's a big episode for Decision Space and for me because joined by uh, creative head of Buried Giant Studios, designer of many of my favorite board games, Cole Wehrle. Cole, thanks for coming on.
It is my pleasure. I think this is a lovely podcast, and I'm happy to have parachuted my way in.
Thank you. I'm sure that so just for if people are listening in the future to give a time frame for when this conversation is happening. You have, as of 2 weeks ago, finished up your first Buried Giant crowdfunding campaign for an ARCS expansion. So I imagine that you're busy in a different way than you were a couple of weeks ago, right?
We had this moment on, I think it was on Monday or Tuesday, where I was talking to the staff, and I said it kind of flippantly that this was really kind of the first day of the rest of our lives. We had arrived at this moment where, for the first time in 4.5 months, nothing was on fire. We had this exceptionally difficult winter and spring where there were so many active projects. There were so many things that had to be done as quickly as possible and as well as possible. And the ARCS crowdfunding closed, and we gave everyone the rest of the week off. And then everyone came into town, and we had this wonderful company, part retreat, part in-service. I hate calling it a retreat because it makes it sound like we were at a water park. Like, everybody came to town, and we worked like mad for a week together. We played all sorts of games that we were thinking about. We went and saw movies together. We shared meals. And then we all took a long weekend. And then not today, but this week, we started the work of actually finishing the ARCS expansion and doing what's next, but without any of the pressure that if we didn't hit this deadline, everything was going to collapse.
So, okay, I'm jumping way ahead in my notes because you're talking about Buried Giant and the stuff you're working on. Do you mind talking a little bit about how the studio model of game design that you all do at Buried Giant, I think it's sort of outside the norm of the board game industry. I've done a little bit of game design, and it's mostly just like I am an island who designs games in my free time, right? That's not what I do. And I think a lot of publishers essentially exist on independent contract work, people who work for a bunch of different publishers doing various types of things. So what do you think you gain from this studio model that sort of enhances the games you make?
It's a good question because I sort of stumbled into it. I mean, I think even when Patrick hired me, neither one of us had said the word like studio model, those words out loud. And as I was talking about my work with people, I found myself like leaning on it. Like, I think we're building games a little differently. I think we're doing this studio model. And what I meant by that was that we were working in a full-time capacity on these games. Now, as you say, almost all of game publishing today works on a much older model, which we might call like the publisher model, where you have creators and you have publishers, and they have different roles to play. And you could imagine, if your designs are really taking off, you might someday have an agent, or you might have like an editor or an illustrator that you like working with. But this is all being done on a case-by-case basis, where the publisher is primarily the financier of the print run, the marketing infrastructure, maybe a brand, maybe. But then the creative work is owned by the people who are making it. Now, this model is great if you are a well-regarded board game designer or you are a publisher. All of the money has a way of like accruing in either of those buckets. If you are a contractor or a designer starting off, there's very little money. And I don't mean that to I'm not trying to go after Vital Lacerda or any of the designers who are doing well or the publishers who publish them. I think it's fine. It's a consequence of this model. It tends to concentrate a lot of the profit with the people who've sort of already made it. Now, that isn't the only way to make games. And in fact, even that sort of singer-songwriter, like artist agent model, it's pretty new. It's really only like 20 or 30 years old. And before that, we had just brands. We had just these publishers who were churning out games for a general audience, and you wouldn't even credit the designer. But for the people who were working in that model, sometimes they were selling designs as if they were, selling an ad or an article, but sometimes they were just on staff. And something really remarkable happens when you put people on staff in creative work, which is they start to get security and freedom to explore like really difficult ideas that might not cash out, and also to take on projects that would be impossible in any other context. When I was at Leader, we were looking at this project. It was so interesting. It was a compelling project for sure, but it was from an external designer. And when I chatted with the designer about our submission process, they were a little taken aback because their whole personal design engine, the thing they were using to build these games, was contingent upon them signing like a game a quarter. And so when I was talking to them, they're like, "Well, I really want to know if you're going to say yes or no to this game because I have to then either shop it around so I don't lose that 3 months of work, or I can move on to the next project." And this is a very well regarded designer, and I who should be have reached escape velocity and not have to worry about things like that. And it really bummed me out because they weren't thinking about their game as this project that they were going to have like a multi-year relationship with. They were thinking about it as the fruit of a busy summer, and they were ready to move on to the next project. And that is just so counter to how I think about games. Like the projects that I want to work on, uh, a year of work is sort of the minimum. That's like table stakes for getting into these projects.
That totally makes sense. And do you think that, I think that we have this idea of like the designer as author that maybe like sort of goes back to sort of like early Euro games or whatever, where it's
Right.
like you are the designer and you take ownership of it. Does that change at all when you're working in a studio with the same people from like the very beginning? Because I mean, obviously you're like credited as the designer on your games and
Right.
not to take away from that. But like, do you think that like working with the because I also think about how, like, since you're working with the same people, you make games probably mostly for the same audience, and that's probably intentional, I'm guessing,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah, I mean, some of why got really interested in the studio model is thinking about where I felt like game companies had failed me as a player. Because when I was playing a lot of games when I was younger, this is the late '90s and early 2000s, there were all these players who wanted to play certain kinds of games, but the publishers like weren't making them. And there was something there was some kind of disconnect that had been created. And I think a studio model like allows for a much deeper level of product support because you can have a person who's responsible for it. But it's really important to me that when we think about game making, that we recognize the kind of communal nature of games generally. So you can kind of tell this story with as wide of a time scale as you want to give it. But games have basically always been made by their players. Like for the entire like history of humanity, to play games is to make games is to play games. Like this is the same like little dialectic. It's the same process that's producing the game. It's a little bit like learning that a speaker and a microphone are kind of the same thing. Where we are creatures at play, and to play is to create, and to create is to play, right? But there are these times when you kind of like convince yourself that maybe you don't need the other players and you've got some idea that is so brilliant and good that if you can just articulate it, the players will show up. And those are moments I think of like a profound failure of imagination. It's a failure to recognize the importance of players. The fact that the thing you're making, the game, it isn't really a thing that you're making by yourself. It only comes into existence when it's sat at a table and when it's activated through play. So when I'm working on a game, my name's on the box, and the way I've always treated box credits is that essentially it's a recognition of the executive authority. That at some point someone had to decide what was going to be in the box and what wasn't going to be in the box, and that person gets their name on the box, and that's actually it. So like saying that it can sound almost tyrannical, but actually, I don't wanna take credit for every single idea that is in the box, only the
Yeah.
fact that the ideas happen to be sitting in that specific box in that time. So you feel a lot more like an editor or a director, and the identity of, I'll say the brand of a designer to me is a very powerful thing, because it can arrange like a really complex set of intentions in a way that can be talked about, financed, built out. You can articulate a vision, and all of that is like sitting under my author credit, which is very useful because it helps us sell the object. And so all this
Yeah.
gets into like commercialism like
Yeah, yeah,
pretty
yeah.
pretty quickly. I mean, it's so funny when people talk about auteur theory. It's like really easy to get snooty like very quickly. I mean, I don't know, you're saying a French word, right? So you're already like halfway there. But it's important to note that like that way of doing it was to elevate, like it was a recognition that certain games had kind of unifying style, or certain films had certain unifying stylistic principles, and that unification could operate as a kind of brand, as a kind of marketing entity that you could use to finance something, to build something even bigger than just the work of one person scribbling on a piece of paper. So when I'm designing, in studio, everyone, it's very horizontal. I want everyone to feel like they can bring up ideas. I want it to be a very open and loud and even kind of like raucous writer's room. Anyone who's ever play tested with me has seen this, where it's ridiculously horizontal. Like if you joined the playtesting Discord 30 minutes ago, I am going to read every word of your like 1,000-word rant about how much you hate the project. I'm going to read every word of it. I might even like address some of it. And out of that emerges, I think there's always a cycle that new playtesters go through where initially they are empowered. And it almost seems like this is a chaotic moment. It's total anarchy. And if they speak loud enough, they can get their way. But then gradually, I think what people find, especially folks who have playtested with me for a really long time, is that there is like a specific voice that it's mine, but it's also an aggregate of all the voices that are involved in the project. And that everything is slowly being put into alignment with that voice. And it doesn't really matter if someone writes like 1,000 words a day to try to move the design in one way or another. It's either harmonizing with the central vision of the game or it's not. And that's how I like to make games. It's a really noisy, abrasive, difficult process with lots of voices. But I find that it gives access to this way of thinking about games where the reception of the game and its design process are kind of one thing. And so I'm very rarely surprised when I read like a game's reviews. I sort of like have already heard it all.
Sure. So, okay, to kind of jump to another thing, we've talked to you've mentioned like reception of games and kind of, the commercial aspect of games. So one thing I listen to a lot of and read a lot of interviews that you've done, and I think maybe I'm mischaracterizing, but I think you've mentioned before that like when you're at conventions and you're talking to publishers or designers in the general hobby, that you feel kind of like weird or the odd man out, or like you're not on the same wavelength as them. But when you go to these like historical game conventions, you're talking to like historical game publishers and designers, that you're like, these are my people. And I'm just curious, like, because I think your games are like some of my favorites. I'm sometimes surprised at how commercially successful they are with the general hobby, because they seem so out of step with sort
Mhm.
of what rises to the top on BGG much of the time. So like, can you speak to that all, or maybe I'm mischaracterizing things
No, I don't
possibly?
think that's a mischaracterization. I mean, when I started at Leader, I had been designing for I guess 3 or 4 years. I'd been going to conventions for a long time. I had people that I knew and loved talking about games with, but I actually didn't know a lot of people in the professional space. And the professional space has a way of separating itself out from like I'll call it the amateur space or the enthusiast space, where there are people who like work for game companies and they've worked on lots of projects and they get to be a little jaded, you know, in a cool way. And I found myself at parties with some of these people, and this is happening kind of the year after Root came out.
Mhm.
And well, I was so taken aback by the fact that I got to go to a cool secret Gen Con party and meet all these interesting people who had designed all these top 100, top 200 games. And I was starstruck because these are folks who had designed games that I really admired. But I pretty quickly found that we were just cut from totally different cloths. That there was I don't know. I mean, they had a very different thing that they wanted out of their professional life than what I wanted, because I really think about games as these kind of strange objects. They're these little rituals of play that help us understand things about the world. And they're compelling because they're at kind of the edge of our own understanding of the world. And so, like a game that you fully understand, it stops being a good game. And like the example I always give is something like tic tac toe. Like when I taught my daughter when she was 2 or 3 how to play tic tac toe, it was blowing her mind. Like every game we played was this like divine revelation. And then around 5 or 6, she figures it out. The games are always stalling out in cats, and it's not interesting anymore. It's inert because the game space is sort of solved. She kind of knows exactly what it is. And so when I'm working on a game, I like to not I like to work at a place where I feel like I don't actually fully understand the thing that I'm making. And that mystery, the fact that I'm like trying to get like why? I mean, I'm so compelled by Oath or Arcs or something, and I can't quite explain to myself why it's so compelling. And then I'd go to these industry parties where people would tell me exactly why their games were selling well or not selling well. There was so much confidence, but it was a confidence that like made the form so much more inert. And I just found that I didn't really have anything to say to these people. They all seemed very pleasant. I mean, it wasn't like I was running into these like arrogant
Sure.
jerks who were like shouting and pretending to be, fancier than they were. I mean, these were genuinely like lovely people, but as like fellow creatives,
Creatives.
yeah, creatives. I mean, I never want to, segregate ourselves like that. But like as fellow people who like to make things, I had nothing in common with them. And then I was at SD HistCon, this like little historical convention in San Diego, like probably the second one that they ever had. Harold Buchanan invited me, and I was listening to these designers talk about the Battle of the Bulge. Not something I care about. World War II, I have like an incidental knowledge of. I've played a bunch of. I probably know more about World War II from playing board games than from reading books about it, which isn't usually a good sign. But I was listening to all of these war game designers talk about the Battle of the Bulge. It was an interesting conversation. And then at one point, I realized they had all designed games about the Battle of the Bulge. And so they were talking about the design decisions they made and how they were considering all these little elements of the topic. And it was intoxicating. And it was intoxicating because they were interested in something that their game was giving them access to, as opposed to just being interested in the game and its ability to sell copies. And that is the same spirit. I mean, I don't work on World War II games, and I only work on some historical games, but that notion that like we're participating in something that is so much bigger than like whether or not we win a spiel or we sell 50,000 copies or any of those kinds of questions. And those commercial questions, I don't want to belittle them because they are important. Like I am interested in selling games because it's how my team eats and it's how we
Yeah.
get to keep making games. So like I am designing games to sell to a market. Like I spend a lot of time thinking about the product profiles and our our marketing strategies. I mean, all that stuff is so important. But the games themselves, we're not making them to sell them. We're making them to make them. And we sell them to make them.
Yeah, that totally I get that. It's kind of funny when I hear you talk about games sometimes. I think about how I feel like a lot of people when you hear talk about game design, they talk about it almost from like a STEM perspective.
Right.
Like they're like mathematicians and they're like, "Oh, like the decision tree and like, oh, well, this connecting to this." But I feel like I hear you talk about games and it's like a humanities perspective,
It's
right?
a
Like
poetic form. I don't like it's so funny when I find myself in those conversations. I just want to say like I think you need to like think more about meter because we're dealing in like essentially like it's not just a poetic form. We're dealing with a lyric. Like games are these weird narrative spaces. Like you kind of can't have beginning, middles, and ends the way a story can have. You can pretend to have them. People talk about the early game or the mid game or the late game. But when you're playing the game, you're in the space of play. It's like this weird, like suspended temporality. And there are all these very funny narrative things that are possible when you unhook yourself from like one-to-one plotting.
yeah, so okay, so let's talk about narrative because you talk a lot about narrative being something that you care about in games, right? You talked a lot about emergent narrative being sort of like a key element of like what
Right.
you want from your games and storytelling. And this is different from like a storytelling game where I read a paragraph after I flip a card. And so when you talk about emergent storytelling in games, What does that look like to you? And also, like, how do you design for that? Right? If your goal is that your games will tell emergent stories, that the players will tell stories, how do you keep that as a design goal, assuming it is a goal?
There's an observation that I've been quoting recently, and I need to like look up the citation to figure out who the hell I'm quoting. But there's a video game scholar who said that you start playing a game the first time you hear it spoken. The first time you read about a game, you've actually entered the space of the game. I think this is a really important frame because it reminds us that these games are a lot larger than just the experience of sitting around a table. That there's all these kind of secondary and tertiary exchanges that are still being mediated by the game in some very like light way that are worth thinking about. When I was working on Oath, one of the core conceits of the design was the conversation about Oath that I imagined when Oath wasn't being played. So let me answer the question directly. Like, how do you even start constructing that? Well, the first thing you do is you think about what objects are you giving the players to talk about? Uh, what are the pieces called in the game? What are the actions that players take? I mean, you're kind of populating like a syllabary, like you're saying, okay. I mean, it's not that. I mean, it's really it's much more direct than that. You're designing a dictionary of terms. You're designing, what verbs, what objects. I always tell younger designers when they're starting, like, think about your nouns and your verbs. Just get down to those base units because when you play the game, those are the words that players are going to use. They're going to construct a narrative about the experience of play that isn't exactly the game. And I mean, this is a very sprawling answer, but it's worth meditating on for a second. You and I, we could play a game of Terra Mystica without saying a word. And that's actually true for basically all games. We can play a game of chess without saying a word. But when we describe that game to a friend or partner, we have to use words to like stitch together the different ludic moments. And so there's some kind of narrative that is coming up. And oftentimes when I talk about things like emergent narrative, what I'm really talking about is the fact that the game itself is generating the story. I am not generating the story as the designer. Because the game is that place of contact between the object of play and the players, right? As a designer, I am a little ghost in the machine. Like I help build the object of play, but I'm not sitting at the table. And I think games with strong emergent narratives are the ones that surprise designers and the ones that players that are very like fecund, that are developed, that are generating all these amazing narrative moments that are stretching out the possibilities that were first outlined. Because what you want is not just a language that the players can use to communicate, but a language that is so robust that it can start generating its own terms. And it how do you build for that? Well, it's complicated. I think it has to do with thinking about a game system as a framework
Okay.
where as you are building the objects in the game, you aren't being overly prescriptive. So like I hate sitting down. Actually, here, I'll tell you a story. I was staying on someone's floor at BGG Con back when it used to be very hard to get tickets to BGG Con. And I found a way in and I needed a hotel space and somebody had a hotel room and and I said, "Could I like bring a sleeping bag?" And they
Yeah.
were fine with that. And I hadn't I think it was like right before Premiere came out. So it was like it was maybe 2014 or 2015 this happened. And I had breakfast with this person I was staying with, and they found out that I had started working on design. They were interested to talk about it, the reason they were interested to talk about it is they wanted to talk to me about a co-op game they were designing. And throughout this entire breakfast we had, he kept saying like, "I've got this Act 2 problem in my co-op." It was so drilled in, but he couldn't solve it because he was like applying a screenwriter's logic to a game problem and not recognizing that like games generate narrative in really, really strange ways. And I think you can make a game that like sounds like a TV show. You could even make a game that sounds like a good TV show, and there are lots of games like that. But it's at those moments when they are least like games. Like I love the Arkham Horror card game. I think it's a
Okay.
masterpiece, and I think the worst part is when I have to read the paragraphs
Yeah.
because all of the interesting emergent like muscle of that game, it just falls to ash. And I'm reading a short story, and the short stories are good. It's not this isn't a slag on the writing. The writing, I think, across that series is like pretty strong. But I play that game because I'm watching my deck fall apart and all of these like interesting traumas. And when you get those, when you get I can't remember what they're called offhand, but like those negative statuses when you have your paranoia triggering or like you're imagining someone's hunting you, all of that is handled so beautifully within the game system. But then when I get to the end and it says like read 7A, I don't know. I'll read it and it'll be fine, and then I'll move to the next thing and hope something amazing happens.
That's how I feel about when I played Earthborn Rangers and like because similar kind of vibe. And when I play that game, I get more excited about when I flip the card and the symbol makes the one animal chase the other animal and do this than like when I have to like read a text,
Yeah.
right?
It
Um,
it's a different way of playing the game. I mean, I actually think there's this. I'm trying to think about some example. I mean, I think a really good one is something like Zia, the
oh, I
Zaya
love that game. Yeah,
Legends
yeah,
of the
yeah.
Drift. I think that the narrative is done really, really well in that game because it's so short.
Yeah.
It is a punchy 2 sentence, and then you move on. And
Well, this is
I've been impressed by Iridia, the follow up game, which I
okay.
think some people were. I don't know. I mean, I think some people were frankly like disappointed that it was more of a generic fantasy setting, but I actually think how that game does its storytelling is really cool because it gets out of the way and is like pretty like elliptical and is just smartly rendered.
Well, so I think your games are so smart in doing exactly what you're talking about because I think about playing a Blighted Reach campaign, and my fate has like a sentence that gives meaning to everything I do, right? And you're
Mhm.
letting me fill in what that sentence means. You don't actually even tell me what that
No.
means, right? I've got this sort of like vague, sort of ethereal kind of thing. And what I really love that you did with Oath is you explicitly give players a book and you say, write your stories. And I think that just by giving the player that chronicle, you're telling them, like, I want you to give meaning to your play, right? You're being explicit in so like when my group played, we played like 7 games in a row as soon as Oath came out. And we said whoever won the game had to write the chronicle because we said like, the winner tells the history, right? So the
Mhm.
the winner of the game has to, and so after the game ends, whoever wins is taking pictures of everything, right? They're taking pictures and then they take the book home and then they read the next time we played the chronicle of what happened. And like I specifically remember my brother had one off, there's like a card that's like long lost heir or something like that
Sure.
that enabled him to win. And his whole narrative was about like, you know, him like as like someone with a family connection that was forgotten, and like he gave that sort of meaning in the whole thing. And I was just like, we would not have done that if you had not given us a book and said, this game's going to tell a story and I want you to tell the story.
Mhm. Yeah, when we were working on Oath, one of the funniest things about that game is that I feel like I had a very strong sense of what I wanted it to feel like, but I had no idea if anybody would actually wanna play a game like that. So it's this, like, very weird, like, I think Oath, for the people who know, it's by far the most experimental game I've ever worked on. It is, like, the edgiest, strangest, like, most out there design, and it's because of how it asks players to think about play and to prioritize and what is informing their own priorities when they play the game. And so Oath came out during COVID. It sold really pretty well. It was quite expensive, and so that it's always hard to like compare sales numbers for games that like literally cost twice as much as other games. But it was a completely reasonable success. I thought, great, I'm going to go work on other things. I was working on arcs. Um, but because it came out during COVID, we didn't have any release shows, and I kind of didn't meet people who were playing a lot of Oath. And then in 2022, we start going to shows again, and people are coming up to me with these Chronicle books that have like 80 games in them.
Yeah.
And there's a video I show sometimes that I took at Essen where so this person caught me on the floor of Essen and showed me their Chronicle book. And it had like fold out poetry and illustrations and little cartoons in it, and then also just a ton of writing. And I thought, okay, there's something to this. There's something that this game is like activating and making possible. And then when we went into the expansion, I went into it with the idea of, I think some of the people who are really getting into Oath are actually making it better than it even deserves. And like, what happens if we actually think about how we're using this house and remodel it for use? And so it was a really interesting product to work on because we went through the whole design and really strengthened all of the metagame components of the whole thing.
Yeah, I'm really excited about that. In talking about players constructing narrative, one thing that so my co-host Brendan and I did like a two-part, like 3-hour deep dive on Root last year. We played a ton of Root. It
Mhm.
was already like a game I loved, and I got him into it, right? We put in a ton of reps. And his whole takeaway from Root is that Root is a game that like casts the players as roles or gives them characters, like, and then you have a role to play, right? Do you think that that's accurate for like some of your games that you're like, because I think of your games as encouraging role play to a certain extent,
Mhm.
maybe more so than a lot of board games. Do you think that that's accurate?
That's an interesting question. Like, do you know when you sit down to play? Okay, so I'll use root as a starting point, and then we can
Okay.
figure out the answer to this question together. Because in root, you get a faction, and maybe
Yes.
use the draft, or maybe you just gave yourself the faction that you happen to know how to play. And that's your role, right? Like for sure, that's determining how you're interacting with all the games, with all the other players of the game. Except one of the things that is so remarkable about Root, and a lot of credit here goes to the team at Leader Games. I'll give a specific shout out to like Josh when he was there, and Nick even. Um, when you start playing Root, where none of the base factions are in the game anymore, what it means to play the Vagabond in a game without cats is like pretty strange, and you have to figure out what that role means. So like you get those fish out of water circumstances where players have to kind of figure out, what do I want my role to be? Now, when you play Pamir starts with this kind of bizarre loyalty draft where you have to pick your starting coalition. And it has, I mean, there's almost no inertia to it. Like it doesn't really matter what you're starting
Yeah.
well. It matters a little bit. I mean, it's in there for a reason. But after you get like your second card, you start creating like a little identity about yourself. But actually, I think one of the problems with Pamir is a design. I mean, gosh, if I were to like run a tournament for any game I'd work on, it'd be like a Pamir Arcs tournament. I think it's a tremendously like high skill cap game. But as a design, I mean, when I look at it now, and it's about as Root. I mean, well, in many ways older. Premiere, I guess, is 11 years old at this point.
Yeah.
Um, the sense of player identity can sometimes feel like a little light. Like I'm not really sure who I'm supposed to be, and it's because
Yeah.
I've done this Avery Adler like move where I'm asking the players to be the connections between these political actors, where you're not the
Yeah.
political actors themselves, you're like the glue that's holding them together. And that's very useful from a game design perspective, but it's like less useful from a storytelling point. Now, it was actually I was dealing with this problem when I was working on Oath, because Oath, the very like simple pitch of Oath, and Oath is a funny game because it's like the sprawling like 6-year project. It's this huge thing, but there are all these ways to boil it down, right? And one of the ways I always tell people is like, oh, it's a game that remembers how you played it, right? Every end state is also a start state. That's neat, cool. Maybe I sold a copy of the game with that pitch. Nice. However, there are other ways of pitching Oath, and one of them is it's a PAX game where you embody your own subjectivity in a playing piece that interacts and moves around the PAX market. And so and I think I heard you talk about this with Andy when you're talking about Ren, and how PAX Renaissance has this like color and spirit to it that you feel like you don't sometimes see in Premiere, which I fully agree with, by the way. Like I adore PAX Renaissance. I think it's like a highly imperfect game, but I don't care because its messiness is so interesting. And Oath to me gives me what I want the PAX system to do, which is that like I am in a world that is changing, and it's changing because of this amazing invention called like a playing card, which can have all this lovely character on it. And the world is shifting, and I am moving around in the world, and objects have gravity, and I have limits as a player agent. And I think when you start to like build that that framing, it opens up all these amazing, again, like narrative possibilities, and it's why like Oath's storytelling is so intriguing because the game barely gives players any world building. Like,
There's like no proper nouns in Oath,
yeah, it is
right?
just the yeah. I did not want to invent a single name in
Yeah.
Oath's world building, and there was always a funny I think I named like almost every Oath card. There's a couple exceptions, but when I was getting cards from the people I was collaborating with, I was very often revising them because they had to be a little general, but also like very precise. Like they had to be precise but unspecific or something. It's a very weird.
Yeah.
I don't quite have the language to describe how those names work, but you have to be able to look at the object and then project onto it meaning and history. And
Mhm.
it's this incredible thing that happens with Oath, where I think the best thing you can do as an Oath player is play 3 games in, like, a weekend, because that when you get to game 4, not only you're going to have, like, the recent bruises, but you're also gonna have, like, these half-remembered bruises and also, like, a weird limp that you can't remember where you got it. And that's when the world starts really, really coming alive.
I get the feeling when you talk about that, like, Oath, and maybe Oath seems, like, personal to you in a way that, like, your other leader games, I feel like you talk about them differently.
Sure.
Is I don't know if that's
Yeah,
true or
I
not,
think I
but
mean, like, Root it's hard to talk about Root because I adore Root, but it was, like, a thing that I worked on a long time ago in a
yeah,
very specific context. And Oath was a game that I had been trying to make since, like, high school. Just the idea of something like Oath had been around in all these different ways. It was a really difficult product to work on. And Arcs, which look, if I was standing at the pearly gates and like Saint Renier Knizia was like, if you to get in, you must submit your design, your best design. Like Arcs is what I'm submitting. Like, because I do think just as a challenge, as like a feat of like game design, as a feat of game design, it's my best work. It's like it's the thing that is it feels most balanced, most provocative, but it's like its provocations are controlled.
sure.
Um, and extremely proud of it. It was also a very difficult project to make, and it was the sort of thing that you can only make with a senior team that has been working together for a long time. So like
Yeah,
all of those things were in Arc. And Arcs also I was trying to also answer like really hard essential game design questions about like the nature of asymmetry and player interaction. Like Arcs, there is no piece in Arcs, no part of that bridge that is not bearing like a lot of load. And Oath is different because Oath is like an experiment. It's like a formal experiment that I don't know like the answer to really. And it just it does things that it's funny to describe this because it's tolerant of it's tolerant of play styles and, in a way that, like, Arcs is not. Arcs is brutal. If you don't play Arcs well, the game is gonna tell you you're not playing it well. And Oath is not like that, so we had this very funny thing happen. I was lucky enough, I played 6 games of Oath last weekend in a row over 2 days. I've never done that before in my life. This was a very unusual circumstance. But we had a pool of 5 players. We had the will. I had a pre-production copy of the Oath expansion. And we just played and played and played and played. And if I would have been a little less tired, I would have done another day. I would have easily added 4 or 5 games to that. And while we were playing, I realized that the Oath rulebook, the new rulebook, so New Foundations comes with a new codified rulebook.
yeah,
It didn't have any advice about table talk in it. Like none. It actually, I mean, the new game for people who've played Oath formalizes negotiation rules. Like you are allowed when you're at the same site with someone to give them favor and to sell them your relics, and then other negotiation powers can get unlocked through denizens.
yeah.
But the actual core game says nothing about above the board conversation. And I realized that I had been playing it with very little above the board conversation outside of negotiations just because that's what felt right, but I had never formalized it. And so we made a change to the game at the very end. This always happens. Every game I've ever submitted for publication, there's always one 11th hour change. And the change we made in Oath is at the very end of the rules. Josh and I wrote a little section that are guidelines for table talk. And the variant that we recommend people play with, we said, first of all, everybody should obviously agree. I mean, table talk is incredibly personal. Some tables only want to play a game if they can be very chatty, and other players
Yeah.
only want to play in like absolute steely silence. That's fine. But my preferred way of playing Oath has a very simple a tabletop guideline, which is the active player should narrate their turn. They need to explain what's happening. If they're putting a new
Yeah.
power in play, they should describe it. That's just a courtesy, really. Players are always welcome to talk about the state of the game. You're about to win. I'm about to lose. I'm having a bad
Oath is
time.
the game of who's about to win.
Yeah,
I
who's
mean,
about to
that
win?
is Oath.
You have to be able to talk about that.
You
However,
must.
however, the third rule, which is the most important rule, is players cannot coordinate unless their pawns are at the same location. You cannot coordinate. You can't say, "Hey, come to my site. I'll sell you a relic." Absolutely not. That's coordination. Instead, when you and when we're at the same site, we can say, "Hey, how's your game going? Is there anything that I can do for you? Is there anything you can do for me?" And what ended up happening is it gave the negotiations of the game a spatial character. And
That's
three
funny.
exiles like gathering at the riverbank create the Riverbank Pact. And then they go their different ways and things go a little sideways. And maybe the pact is still going to hold and maybe it's not. Maybe we should get back together. And it was the smallest adjustment, but it informed all those games that we played. And I felt like the letters on the page were like glowing. Like we were playing the hottest and most interesting version of Oath that I could conceive. And it was because of a small adjustment, not to a core game system, but to the social framing in which the game is played.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm very excited for my copy of New Foundations to show up. So, okay, I want to switch gears a little bit. I am the host on this show that has the most tolerance for long, heavy, complex games. Most of my co-hosts, it's not so much their bag, especially of the interactive variety. And we just did an episode recently where we had John Perry on as a guest to talk
Sure.
about complexity and depth and sort of how people underrate the potential depth in light games, that people sort of assume that depth and complexity are always on the same trajectory. And so it was sort of like a defense of light games, I would say, is sort of what the episode turned out to be. Now, you design heavy games.
I do.
Right? And so I'm wondering, could you give sort of the case for heavy games? Like what is if it's maybe not necessarily depth, like what kind of things and experiences can heavy games give us that light games can't? Or why do you personally gravitate, maybe as a designer for sure, but also perhaps as a player, towards long, heavy, complex games?
I mean, I adore John. I probably will agree with like everything he has to say about
I recommend the episode.
Yeah, about the importance of light games, because let me tell you, when the Buried Giants, when we all got together hanging out, what did we play in the evening? Like Chichu, right? Like
Hell yeah.
we love a light game, and there's nothing light about that game. That game is
Hell no.
Yeah, that game is mean as nails. It's deep as
Yeah.
a black hole. I mean, it's incredible.
Yeah.
When I was out of nowhere a few months ago, my wife and I got really into backgammon, and I think it was because I had assumed it was a bad game, and she had assumed it was a bad game, but we realized we had both been like taught by like an uncle or an aunt in our upbringing, and I was like, oh, I don't know, dice, you move the little chips around, it's nothing. And I was like, I think people are like good at backgammon. What does it mean to be good at backgammon? And so we decided to start playing it and think about our play and try to formalize our strategy. Like what are the good strategic guidelines in backgammon? And what we found was it's outrageously deep. There's all sorts of interesting things going on in a game of backgammon. But I don't design backgammon, right? I design these kind of medium heavyweight games. Now, part of why I design the games I do is a little bit of like an indictment as a player of the current marketplace. So I don't make train games. I love train games. I mean, I've got a big shelf of 18xx games over there, and they're probably my favorite like single genre of games. I could play 18xx games all day and night, but I don't just work on designing them because I don't think they need someone like me designing them. I think the 18xx market is very well served, and there are many brilliant 18xx designers working today, lots of games to play. I've never felt like, gosh, I wish there were an 18xx game like X or like Y. I feel the same way about light games, actually. If you play a game like Linko, I mean, that game is staggeringly brilliant. And I play Linko and think, well, I'm glad I never have to design a light game because people are doing it and they're doing it properly. But in the medium and heavyweight section of the market, I feel so like lonely. I'm so consistently like disappointed by games at this weight in the market, and it actually has to do with not just their complexity. I think many of them are too complex, and I realize that is rich coming from me. But it's not that they're necessarily just too complex, it's that they're spending their complexity in really foolish ways. I think they're afraid of their players and they wanna keep them in awe of, like, the elegance of the core system. And so they're if you think about a game can be thought of as, an interface between players. And if the interface is bigger and more complicated, the players kind of squeeze, they get pushed to the margins of the game experience. And so when I sit down to play, like, a big, long, heavy game that I spent $120 on, I'm very excited about, sometimes all I see is like a giant resource exchange grid where a very clever designer has hidden like half an action efficiency here and like half a victory point path there or whatever. And I have to find those things. And that can be interesting, but it bums me out because you're spending the money. Like you bought the luxury car. Like as a player, I am trained to play complicated games. I've been playing games for my entire life. I'm not afraid of a long rule book. Like I've started thinking. I met this interesting group of people who play long games, and at one point they described them like pieces of music, where they're like really long, complicated games are like demanding pieces of music. Like they can't be played by everybody. You need like a kind of a lifetime of training to do it, and they're things of terrible and wonderful beauty, but you have to give them the space that they need. And sometimes, so when I'm interacting with other games in the medium and heavy part of the market, I just feel like you're spending this amazing complexity budget that's been afforded you on questions which I think are fundamentally like quite boring. And here I want to like disambiguate complexity and length.
Okay.
So I spent 14 hours last week playing a game of Mega Empires, which is Francis Tresham's Civilization, kind of like version 3, I guess.
Sure.
And the thing about this game is that it takes a long time, right? I mean, we played 14 hours. I think the game could have gone 15 or 16 without trouble. It happened at 14 hours. We had some players who were brand new. They did not slow down the game in any meaningful way. And in fact, when they showed up, we did a teach of the game, which took about 15 minutes. It's not a complex game at all, but it is long. And there's almost no downtime. And I was talking about this with someone on staff, and they remarked kind of casually like they'd never actually played a long game. They were like, I think the longest game I've ever played is like a game of Arcs that went 2 or 3 hours. And they looked at me and said, "What is it like to play a long game?" And I said, "Well, the thing about most long games is that they're not slow; they're long. Like you are probably taking more actions per minute in an 18xx game than than I don't know than Hot Streak." Like they are outrageously highly efficient at player decisions over time. And they can be exhausting because you can plug into one of those long games and you can be exhausted. I think the really good long games usually don't exhaust players because there's just enough downtime and it's kind of in the right places to give little reprieves. But something really incredible happens when you're playing a long game, which is that the whole form gets to breathe a little bit. You have a chance to make a mistake and be forgiven by another player and to make a mistake again. You have these amazing arcs that just simply aren't possible in the like 90-second framework. When I was working on arcs, well, the first time I pitched it to the staff, I told people, um, there's this effort to combine the Twilight or not to collapse a Twilight Imperium style science fiction game into 90 minutes. When I look at the space of modern 4X design, everyone is trying to shorten it. They're all doing these like works of collapsing, works of compression. But compression is lossy And so all the things that make the game great are actually getting compressed out, and all you're left with are actually the more boring parts. And I hate to say this because like a game like Beyond the Sun can exist, which shows that like there is something to a tech tree, and I do get it. But the most boring part of Twilight Imperium are like the victory point schedules. I think a lot of the texts are like really boring. I think the action structure is like fairly boring. Now there are places where it becomes wonderful, but you only get access to them when you plug in for a long game and you get to see things go up and go down, and you have space to try different strategies to be rescued and things like that. When you shorten games, I think because players will often want games to be exercises in the display of skill. Because of that, you have to make sure that the game is like, what we'd call competitive. And that often translates to ever more elaborate like action efficiency puzzles. And so when I approach heavy games, I'm not trying to design a better puzzle. That's boring. And actually weirdly, short games are way better at puzzles. Like go play Lock if you want a puzzle. Instead, I look at a heavy game as an opportunity to play in a space that is going to afford the players cooler costumes, better set design, like all of the stuff that you get when you're in an opera and not a school play.
And like when you feel the emotions, you feel them deeper, right? Yeah. So this actually gets me at another thing I want to talk to you about, which is your games, I would say, ask a fair amount of players, right? So that your games, okay, so like I'm getting ready to teach John Company to a bunch of our podcast listeners at Geekway to the West this weekend. And so I haven't played John Company about a year.
Sure.
So I'm like watching your heavy cardboard video while I'm driving to work, or listening to it. I mean,
sure.
Ooh,
watch out.
Just to make sure it's like fresh, right? So it's a game that like, if one person is willing to do the work, it can go pretty effortlessly, but there's work to do.
Yeah.
Right. And, playing a Blighted Reach campaign of Arcs, it's a big ask. It's a lot of rules. And so I think for some people, if they're putting in the investment of all of the learning and learning and learning, for a lot of gamers, what they want in return is mastery. Right. Like, or they want agency to say, if I make certain decisions, I'm going to get certain outcomes. And then that makes all this effort worth it. So like, how do you think about like players' perception of like agency or fairness when they're playing one of your games? Because your games ask a lot.
Yeah.
And so if I spent hours learning how to play this game, some players are going to be like, well, then I better like
be good at it.
Right. Be good at it, right? So
yeah. I mean, this is such a fascinating subject because, I mean, again, like think about music as a governing metaphor. Like you have to practice before you show up to band practice, right? Don't show up and be like, oh yeah, so what are we playing? I guess it's this, and you just take out your score. Like, you need to put in the work if you want to do something great with other people. You actually owe it to your table. I think if I could take, wargaming is not a perfect space, but if I could take one social convention from wargaming and put it into the mainstream hobby space, it would be, you have to read the rules in your own time. Like when everyone talks about like, well, I'm teaching my group, I'm the teacher of my group, I think this is like, it's unfortunate because, and look, I say that as the person who is the teacher in my own group. I teach games all the time. I love teaching games.
Yeah.
I think actually I mean, this is a little bit of just a side note about teaching, and then we can talk about fairness, which is, I think there's a lot of joy in a good teach. I got this when I was doing a thing with Mark Herman where he was teaching me South Pacific, and I was like in a weird South Pacific thing where we were playing a position together, and he was just so good at explaining it and talking about why things behave that way. And there was a lot of joy in it. And I actually thought, like, I don't really want to be playing South Pacific against you. I just want you to be teaching me Empire of the Sun. I love teaching Arcs actually for the same reason, because Arcs is sort of design. I mean, I really like designing for the teach. I'm very sensitive to it. And Arcs is a great teach because you can't do a rolling teach. You have to teach everything at the front, but you can teach it in a way where the concepts hook into each other really cleanly. And then you have the players go like, oh, so like this works like that. and they are learning how to play the game in during the teach, not just from what you're saying. They're not just like taking in the information. They're
It's
actually like,
connections are
yeah, they're
being made.
actually actively like in play. And I love when that happens. Um, John Company, again, is like designed to have this rolling teach. I think John Company is also a very fun game to teach. When I was at this 18th century conference, um, I wonder if you recorded your interview with John after or before he was at this conference. So I hung out with John at this 18th centuryist conference, and we played John Company for a group of academics, none of which came from games, had played very many
Yeah.
games, but who knew the East India Company. And so when the enclosure acts come up or the calico acts come up, they're like, "Oh,
Oh.
I know how the calico acts work." And it was very fun to teach the game for them because you would start explaining certain game concepts, and they were immediately making connections and already kind of like playing in that space. I think a really good teach should be a little playful. You want players to start imagining how they're going to play the game during the course of the teach. If they're just sitting there taking in the information, it's not going to work. I mean, anyone who's been in a classroom knows that that's not how anyone gets anything.
So I just want to say real quick, I am a teacher, like that's my job.
Mm-hmm.
And so I love teaching games because I just love teaching, but a game that explaining the theme really well helped me teach the game was Molly House. I think
Sure.
Molly House was actually really hard to teach without explaining the thematic resonance of everything that we were doing, and it just made the whole game make more sense, right?
Yeah.
So like the teach, I think you're getting at, like, first of all, can be a pleasurable experience. Like one thing people talk about with Root is they're like, "Oh, I hate teaching Root." I'm like, "I love teaching Root. What are you talking about?"
Yeah.
Like,
It's
I
such a
love
fun
like
teach.
I love teaching people how to play this game, right? So yeah, I just love what you're getting at. So
Right.
keep going.
I'm going to get to the second part of your question now, which is, all right, everyone does all this work, and then the game doesn't reward their work with skill. They get rewarded with something else though, which is the experience of playing the game. And look, I spent so much time learning how to play Mark McLaughlin's The Napoleonic Wars. And the very first game I played, it ended on a peace roll after 2 hours. And I had food in the oven for dinner. Like I thought we were going to be there all day. And instead, I'm talking to my fellow players like, "Oh, are we going to play Great Zimbabwe or something now that this giant war game's over?" And we ended up making the right decision, which is just start over. Just run it again. And then we got only halfway through the next game. It was really firing and we had to call for time. Nothing wrong with that, you know. Um I I think when you're playing a heavy game, okay, so let me back up. When you sit down to play a game with your friends, you have to ask yourself at some level why you have chosen to spend your afternoon this way, right? And we had this experience happen when we were playing Mega Empires because in Mega Empires in Civ, it's usually pretty clear who's going to win the game. And this is a 9-player game, and so we got 11 hours in, and it was clear that there were 3 leading players of the 9 who had a shot on goal, and then actually of those 3, it was like probably one of them who's going to do it, who's going to win. And we had 3 hours to go. And at some times in my life, I think I would have said like, "Cool, game's over, start over, let's try again." Like let's all get better at the early and mid game. But what that does is it actually like I think it fails to okay, I mean it has I think actually that behavior has a bunch of weird toxic um consequences that I hadn't really realized. One of them is it suggests that all games have to be crab buckets at the end. That's like problem number one. So it like weirdly homogenizes the types of games that are well suited to that. Whereas some games are like, no, they're going to have divergent paths and they're not going to have a really climactic finish. And that's fine. The other thing is it doesn't appreciate the work that it takes to get to that point that we are all sitting. We've been playing for 10 hours and we still have hours to go. And we could just call it for time, or we could just say, hooray, player X, you've won. But instead, we are going to sit through the final slow movement of the piece of music. and we're going to enjoy it and we're going to think about it. And there are places where we can improve our skill and places where we can experience the experience of play because we have all taken the amount of time, like created this space where we're able to play this like huge, like magnificent work. And like, yeah, we're at the resolution of the major themes, but let's listen to them play out. Let's do our best. And then when the game is done, it's done. And I have found that that shift in my own thinking as a player has let me really enjoy in games when I am not even remotely in contention. Because this is a place for me to like understand the shape of the end game. Like what cards are in that late war deck? I just maybe if I could just in this game of Twilight Struggle better understanding how the late war works, that will be enough. Or maybe it's a place for me to like breathe in and look around the table and see these amazing people that I've spent 2 days with and we go into the final, trade phase and we're making exchanges as if we're going to play forever. But it's because the actual decision making in that space is so rich and complex that if you just sort of pretend like my goal is to maximize my trade value and I'm going to use this to get better at the game so that next game when I'm playing I'm a little bit of a stronger player. That's remarkable even if something horrible and random happens, because that's also part of the game, right? I mean, I think the reason I keep talking about Mega Empires, both because I played it recently, it's on my mind, but also because I think it's this incredible flashpoint when we're thinking about questions of agency too. Because when you play that game, horrible things happen to you that were not your fault, and you have to deal with it. And in fact, the entire game is this amazing meditation on like your resilience as a player.
Okay, so this brings me to another point I wanted to ask you about because a clickbaity sort of pull quote that has happened in several interviews with you is you say something that is taken as a hot take about the word fun,
Sure.
right? Like I remember seeing some big picture of your face and under it said like we don't try to make games that are fun, we try to make games that are good or whatever,
Yeah, yeah.
right? Like the so it's kind of funny because I think we talk a lot in the show about CT Wynn's philosophy, talking about like striving play, which I think you said that you've
Yep.
familiar with his stuff. And I think that the word fun probably obviously means different things for different people. So when you say you don't make games that are designed to be fun, I think that you have fun playing these games.
Of course.
Right.
Yeah.
I have fun playing these games. So like,
They
so
are
what do you
joyful.
mean when you say
Yeah,
that? What do you mean when you say that?
let me let me so it's so funny. I feel like whenever I want to like make a ruckus, I just say like I think fun's bullshit, and then
Yeah, exactly.
I'm like,
That's
oh,
what it seems like. It seems like
I'm
you're
like
just
king
making
of
a
Reddit.
ruckus.
No, I mean, usually I'm mentioning it because I have encountered somebody who has like read me the riot act about the importance of like fun, and what I want to believe, is that when they say fun, they mean joy or playfulness, but that's not what they mean. When they say fun, they mean tastes good. And
Like the
there is
dopamine.
this desire sometimes in game design to optimize the experience, all the little haptic levers, everything that you can do to make something that feels good to play, tastes good to play, rewards all of your intuitions, right? Synergizes. Oh, I'm advancing on this track and I get this bonus here and this bonus here and this bonus here and this bonus here. And we're inside a slot machine. And I think the games that have survived and the vast majority of games that are played are not played for that kind of amusement. They're not played for that kind of feedback. I think that actually people play games for lots of reasons. I think they play them for the challenge. I think they play them to spend honestly to better understand the people they are playing with. I mean, it's like why kids play tag, right? They're sizing each other up on that playground. They're running around. They're exploring their friendships in like a new dimensions, right? They're inventing games for each other. They're changing the rules. They're testing each other's tolerances for the inventions of the games that are also testing tolerances. They're not doing it in a way that doesn't involve thought. I mean, this is why I sort of like hate Balatro. And I think Balatro is a very brilliantly designed game, but watching people play Balatro, I'm like, you might as well be in the slots. Like you're just. I was talking to I was talking to Tim Fowers about this many years ago, and I think we were on a panel or somebody made some comment about how they were using a lot of A/B testing in their game design. And Tim had this quip that I thought was just perfect, where he said, like, the problem with A/B testing is you're either going to end up with gambling or pornography at the end of it. And you kind of like you don't know which place it's going to go, but like that's where the dopamine's going to take you.
Yeah.
And I want a game that like sticks to the ribs. I want someone to experience a game that I've played and have it haunt them a little bit. And you don't get that by just being an Oreo, right? So I think, I look, I love playing games. I find game playing tremendously joyful. It is my favorite thing to do if I have a time. If I have time to play a game. I mean, after we finish recording this, like I'm almost certainly going to play a game of Nippon with my son. That I've been looking forward to that all day. I'm certain that we are going to have a good time and have fun. But I don't wanna just have fun, and I think when you design games just to have fun, you end up with a lot of, like, weird incentives and empty calories, and I also think it has a way of flattening all the things that games can do, because you're not just playing for fun, you're playing for all sorts of reasons, so I wanna find ways of talking about games that kind of, like, get past that because it sort of trap it I don't know, I find it traps it doesn't just trap the mindset of the players. It's like a trap for games discourse because we got to ask more from our art than that.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that something that you've talked about before is that like games are capable of eliciting like a wide range of emotions,
Hmm.
right? And so like designing games to make people feel a lot of different stuff, right? Is like what games can do, right? I think about like role playing games. And like the indie role playing space seems to be full of like designers doing experimental things to like make players feel stuff,
Yeah,
right? A lot of different stuff. Um, I have one more sort of like anecdote I wanted to ask you
sure.
about, and sort of this gets a little bit at maybe talking about kind of like you being maybe like dissatisfied with like modern midweight heavy games. It's kind of funny because when you talked about that, I thought about how partially I became a history teacher because I liked history but never had any good teachers, right? So sometimes never had good history teachers, so we want to like be the change that we wish we could have had. But you mentioned something in the Buried Giant Discord server, which probably you didn't think about at all. But
Hmm.
there was discussion about Indonesia, and you said that you taught your kids Indonesia.
That's right.
And what you said was that you found it pretty easy to teach, and you could teach Indonesia to your kids easier than a midweight Euro,
Right. Oh,
right?
sure.
And that, and so like I guess I want to ask. We talk about heavy games, talk about complexity, all of that, um, and we talk about teaching games. But like, how do you maybe use your complexity budget in a way that like you can still make your game accessible to a lot of different types of
Hmm.
people?
Yeah, I mean, this is. I think, boy, there's like a few different. I'm trying to not have people get mad at me. Um, I don't mind. I don't mind a little bit. Yeah, let me think about the right way to answer this. At BGG for many years, I haven't been in a few years, so I don't know if they still do this, but they have like a little cordoned off like hot games area.
Mhm.
And it used to be that if you wanted to play the new Essen releases, you could go to this hot games area. And if you just sat at the end of a gameplay, the group that was playing that game would kind of teach you how to play it. And then that group would move on to the next game, and then you would play the new game. And when another group would come, you would kind of teach that incoming group. And it was like this for a few years where there was this sort of spirit of let's teach these games so that we can all play all the hot new Essen releases as quickly as possible. And if you listen to those teaches, they were filled with like shorthand and all these like little, well, it's a Rosenberg game. And so you're going to be putting guys, you spin the wheel this way, end of turn, feed your family. Okay, blah, blah, blah. Got it. But there's this one little thing. And uh, if you have never taught someone who's never played like a euro how to play a euro, it is like a nightmare because there are so many like weird little assumptions that have snuck in that you aren't sensitive to because you've played a lot of games. When I started working on games, we would look at or when Drew and I did the Premiere Kickstarter, I remember looking at backer reports and just like learning where everyone kind of lives in a very like distant way. You're like, oh wow, we like sent one to Silicon Valley, or like, that's going to the Upper West Side of New York. I wonder who lives there. And it's this funny thing. And what we started realizing when the games came out is that a lot of the Whirligig games were being played by people who actually don't play a lot of games, but they were interested in the subject, and so they were getting into it because they were interested in the subject. And Pamir might be the first historical game they've ever played, maybe the first like board game that was designed this century that they had ever played. And it wasn't causing any trouble. We didn't have more rules questions from that population of players. We had a lot of rules questions though from like the BGG audience. And I think it's because a lot of times when I'm working on games, I don't start with genre conventions. I start with like system constraints. And that forces me to come up with sometimes like strange mechanisms that are trying to fit a specific need for the design, but which aren't the traditional way of answering that problem. And I'm not doing this to be a jerk. Like I'm not trying to like start a fire and be like, ooh, look at these innovations. It's genuinely because like this is the only way I could figure out how to get the game to do what I wanted. But because of that, a lot of my games butt up against design best practices, and they are very hard for players who have played a ton of games, who feel themselves to be like expert players. It's very hard for them to like understand how the game works. I mean, if you've never hung out in the forums of a newly released game that I've worked on, like bless you, stay away, because you're going to find this insane dynamic where there are people who are convinced it's the best game that's ever happened, and they do not understand how anyone could disagree. And then you're going to see people who have the exact opposite opinion, that they've just witnessed an affront to good taste and good design, and they cannot understand how anyone could possibly like it. And both sides like fully cannot see the other side. And no one wants to be there. But again, I don't mind too much because I'm very happy with the work that I've done. I'm excited to do more work like it. I'm glad that there's an audience that is looking to support it. So, I sit down with my kids and they want to play a game, and I get Indonesia because the new printing happened to come, and they look at the box and they're like, "Ooh, that box is beautiful," because it is.
It's shiny.
It's very shiny. It's got a little rainbow strobe on it.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
great. And they open it up. I'm like, "Oh, these boats." And I look at the rules and I'm like, "Oh, this game's actually like pretty easy." There's like some bookkeeping stuff, but kids don't really mind bookkeeping. And I taught them how to play Indonesia, and we played the first kind of 2/3 of the game. And they played very badly because I play Indonesia badly. I mean, I think Indonesia is fiendishly difficult to play well. Like what those auctions, the merger auctions, are asking you to do is profoundly complex. And as you get better at the game, it becomes easier to make more catastrophic errors. So like sometimes as you get better at the game, like your play gets safer, where you're like, oh, I scored, I don't know, 90 in Agricola, and like maybe I'll try to score like a 94 next game or something, but you're not going to score like -6. You're like way outside of that world. Indonesia's not like that. As you get better at the game, you get like you're going to run your little race car like closer to the cliff edge.
Yeah,
And
for
then
sure.
yeah, and a good 18xx feels the same way. I mean, I often say that like the second best player at any 18xx player at any 18xx table is the player with the lowest score, because they saw their window, they took their risk, it didn't quite pay. And oftentimes the players who get second in those games are just playing a conservative strategy. So I taught my kids how to play this game. They did great. The rules were no barrier at all. And then I sat down and we were playing. I mean, gosh, I don't want to call anyone out, but like we played some very well regarded like medium and heavyweight Euros, and they were so hard to teach. They had so many like layers of abstraction. And I think about something with my oldest son. Whenever I teach a game, the first question he always asks is like, "Can I trade my resources?" Is this one of those games where you can trade resources? And whenever he says that, it's a reminder that he's already trying to imagine how to play the game, and he sees that there are resources, and he knows that if we were playing Catan, he could be trading them, and so
Yeah,
he's
yeah,
like,
yeah.
"Well, why can't I?" He's always interrogating
Yeah,
the
yeah.
game in that way. Um, but it's I don't know. I mean, I have a lot of like strange thoughts on this specific subject because I think games are complex, sure, but our lives are filled with so many complex games, and anybody who wants to be playing these games can play them. Like they're just
It's a motivation issue in
yeah,
part,
it's a
right?
motivation issue. And I think it's often not helped by the person in the group, though bless them, who's like trying to force a specific game on the group. And this happens a lot. I mean, I kind of used to be this person where I'm like, guys, Power Grid. Have you heard about Power Grid? And all my friends are like, what are you talking about? Like, don't you want to go just ride bicycles or go to a show or something? And I'm like, no, Power Grid, get into this thing. Um, but when you open it up a little bit, um, I think oftentimes, I mean, I guess if I were to boil this whole diatribe down to like a pretty simple um, ethos and maybe even like a prescriptive like plan of action, I think that all the efforts made at accessibility in games, and I'm not talking about accessibility in the like larger, more important way, but I'm talking about the accessibility of gateway games and things like that. I think that they are much more likely to alienate potential audiences than they are to bring them in
Sure.
because people who want to engage with the game, they don't need elaborate UIs. They want to learn a game. I mean, that's always like the classic example of. I had a friend who was teaching his parents how to play some Euro, and the fact that the cards had all this UI stuff explaining how they worked made it feel like a kid's game. And like
Mm,
these are group of people who've been playing Hearts their entire life. There's no like
sure.
explainer on the Hearts cards explaining when the suit cracks, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And so you just have to trust people that like there are you've built a game, maybe it will find its audience, maybe it won't. Um, but you can't bring someone to it who doesn't want to be there. Like they're not going to have a meaningful
Yeah.
relationship with the thing.
All right, so can I end our time together by selfishly asking you for design advice while I have you?
Hit me.
So I'm a history teacher. I'm a government social studies history teacher. I desperately want to design historical games, and
Mm-hmm.
I've tried, and I find it a gargantuan, intimidating task.
Sure.
And so my questions for you, first of all, is one thing I get stuck in is I feel like I need to become an expert on a subject before I even start thinking about a game on a
Mm-hmm.
subject. Like I have a subject I'm interested in. I'm like, well, I have to read every book and scholarly article on this subject before I start designing. And then I just never get to the game. And then my other question is like, I have these fun ideas for like interactions and mechanisms, but I'm worried about once I become a master of this subject, I'm worried about breaking the simulation
Sure.
by sort of so how my two questions first of all is like how do I start?
Yes,
And then my
correct. And
and then
how
my
do I
second one
finish?
and then my second one is like, well, how do I create an interesting decision space that doesn't break the theme, which is what people are here for?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so first of all, you don't need to be a subject matter expert at all. In fact, oftentimes when I'm working on historical games, I'm not reading a book and then making a game about the book I just read. I am being animated by a sentence, a paragraph in that book that highlighted some tension that could be explicated with a game. And then once I have that, it is about capturing that like dramatic moment properly. But it's not just it's never a matter of becoming a subject matter expert. It's about finding the right moment. You're so much more like a photographer than you are like a simulation builder. I think, and there are different
Okay.
schools of thoughts about this. Um, the second thing, which is really important, is to recognize the limits of the game and the assumptions that you're already making. So I use a couple different tools for this. So the most important tool is to remember that you're not making a history game, you're making a work of historical fiction. And so your goal should be to capture the world as it was imagined by the actors, because that can help explain why they made the decisions that they made. And this can involve using very like strange and even like oblique uh, adaptation strategies. So I'll give one very specific example. In John Company, there's a law system where every turn, the prime minister will select a law, bring it up before Parliament. People vote on it. Maybe it happens, maybe it doesn't. These laws are almost all drawn. Well, are all drawn from actual historical laws. However, in reality, most of the laws concerning the East India Company were passed in these like big omnibus packages. So it's like a complete fiction that they would be like slowly passed in this weird piecemeal way over like 150 years. Like we're really talking about like three big legal packages. But you can't do that in a game and have it make any sense. And so I just took a little hammer out and broke them into small pieces and also used that same system to talk about things that were like adjacent to laws that made sense. It's a total fiction. I mean, essentially, it's a lie, but it conveys the right thing. I mean, I'll give you another example. So I'm working on Infamous Traffic right now, and in the original game, Infamous Traffic had this alternate victory and end condition where the Taiping Civil War breaks out and China falls apart, and then there's this alternate victory condition. However, I'm doing all this research and I'm realizing I was kind of wrong. In the first edition of Miss Traffic, I sort of viewed the Taiping Rebellion as a fail state and as a game ending condition. Like, that's not quite right. Because really, the rise of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom coincided with the opium trade, and it like needs to be presented in a way where it's like more simultaneous. And so I built this new way of doing it that was very detailed. But I had this funny problem, which is originally when I built it, the Taiping Rebellion would break out in the city that it broke out in, and then it would grow in the way that it grew historically, and then maybe players would stop it, and maybe they wouldn't stop it. But I realized that if you go into playing a game about a rebellion and you know where it's going to happen, it like weirdly warps everything about the decision making, and you get people saying sentences like, "Well, we know the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom is gonna sack, this particular city, Nanking, at this time." And I thought like, "Well, I hate that sentence. I don't like that at all. That doesn't feel even remotely correct." And so I loosened up the system to have it be a little random where it starts and a little random how it behaves. And it's now doing very weird ahistorical things. And in fact, I even loosened it up more because originally I was like, well, maybe it'll start in the 1840s because the visions happened in the 1830s. So then you'll get to the 1840s, and then the 1850s it really heats up. And but it took all of this like funny work in the game space to like stack the deck. This is like the old graduated deck problem where it's like, okay, we need to have certain tiles out on certain turns and then you mix them up again. And I hate that stuff. I hate that kind of like admin. And I thought, well, actually, the Taiping Rebellion could have happened earlier. Maybe it happened a little bit later. And like, look, I am quite sure that like, Stephen Platt or like any number of fantastic historians would be like, no, it like happened in the 1830s for lots of good reasons. And they're mostly right. I mean, they're entirely right. But for the sake of the game, having a long tail option where it could break out a little earlier or could start a little later, that's okay. And so you have to allow yourself um, the privilege of being a novelist, the privilege of being someone who's like arranging something. And this is really the main thing. It all boils down to this. Historical games, I think generally are really bad at teaching history, even the good ones. What they are good at is teaching the history of feeling and
Mhm.
transporting players. So like I think the most effective history game you can play is a history game that you're playing while also reading books on the subject and attending lectures on the subject and having group projects. I mean, if it's all sitting together in a large framework, I think games are this like fantastic glue, or not glue. I mean, they're like a connection to the past that can be really, really, really powerful. But they're going to be bad at teaching dates and names.
Sure.
So and as soon as you realize that, you're like, okay, well, you know, what are the essential characteristics of the story that I'm trying to tell? Let me build those and really do treat the history of the game as the set dressing, the context for the kind of game contest. And then the other little addendum to all this is genuinely, some historical subjects are bad at for games. Like when you're working
Okay.
on a game, you
Yeah.
might be like, actually, this isn't a good subject to be gamed.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you see your non-historical games as like a different beast or a different genre from your historical games?
There's the historical games have to be accountable to the past, which I realize that statement like sort of goes in conflict with everything I just said. But in the same way, you know, Hilary Mantel had to be accountable to Tudor history when
Yeah.
she's writing Wolf Hall. Like I have to be accountable to the records of the East India Company. This whole experience of Infamous Traffic, I've like found two like straight errors that I made in my thinking that I'm very happy to correct. I owe it to the past to like try to get it right. Whenever I'm working on a historical game, I always go through the mental exercise of realizing that because the subjects I tend to pick tend to be a little bit more obscure, this might be a player's only contact with this particular subject, and I can't screw it up. I can't mislead them. And so that is like a grave obligation. That said, my non-historical games have similar kinds of obligations, but they're obligations to philosophy and to narrative theory and to the like form of the game itself. Like when I'm like Root is not a game about ideology. It's a game about political postures, geopolitical postures, really. And the kinds of considerations that went into the design of the factions that I worked on and many of the factions I helped on was how would this posture operate if in this particular context? And to answer those questions, I read lots of case studies of counterinsurgencies and of wars. I mean, it is very anchored. Oath is a very similar way. Like Oath has there's a political framework that Oath operates in, and everything has to make sense in that political framework. And that means being accountable to a work of philosophy, just not necessarily a work of history.
Sure. Or is it Braudel who Oath is operating
Yeah,
at that scale, right? Yeah.
Oath is my little love letter to Ferdinand. Um,
Yeah.
like I I think Brodel's one. There's like weirdly like a whole collection of folks who Oath is filled with like love letters to like E.P. Thompson and all sorts of like other folks too.
Well, it's like a game about history, but it's not a historical game,
Right? Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Yeah.
and it's a game about like history telling. I mean,
Historiography.
yeah, it's a game about historiography. And one of I got really into Pierre Brandt's works on Alexander the Great when I was working on Oath and right after. He's like a really interesting French historian who is like fascinated with the historiography of Alexander the Great. And I found it really, I mean, he has this amazing book called Darius in the Shadow of Alexander. I think that's what it's called. And it is about how everything we know about Alexander's great rival, we only know through these like Roman historia or histories of Alexander. And so like how weirdly it distorts. Like how can you write a biography where you're like listening to a tin can that is listening to another tin can phone?
Right.
And
Yeah.
and what he comes up with is like, again, it's this remarkable like extended meditation on the lossy character of history and history telling over time. And I wanted to do something like that with Oath. I mean, it's like why there aren't a lot of guidelines about how to use that little chronicle book. Because the dream with Oath, I mean, one of my like deepest, fondest hopes with the game is I'm excited for a kid to stumble into a copy of Oath in their grandfather or mother's closet that got played and then abandoned and then played and then abandoned, and to just sort through it. And maybe they partially reset it, maybe they just continue playing it, maybe it becomes just a toy and it's just a total mess. But like just an object that can hold that kind of history, I find so beautiful. And I think it's perfectly in keeping with the kind of central spirit of the game.
That's great. Cole, I don't want to take up any more of your time, but we had a very serious conversation. But I just want to say I have so much fun being a total jerk to my friends playing your games. So thank you for making them. Um, Thanks so much for coming on and talking about all these questions I've wanted to ask you for a very long time.
I mean, look, I first of all, it is my extreme pleasure to be here. I love this show. I think being working in games, one of the things that happens when you work in games is you kind of can't consume a lot of game media content. Not because you don't want to or you're sick of it, just because there isn't time. But I do like your podcast. I think you all do a wonderful job. And also thank you for also uh reminding me to remind all your listeners that the games that I like play is profoundly silly. Like to be silly is to be playful. And all the games that I work on are absurd. They're quite silly.
Yeah.
I mean, John
Yeah.
Company is an extremely serious game about nonsense, about straight nonsense. And it's one of the hard things that it's one of the hard things to talk about with other folks because people are like, "Oh, you made this game about the East India Company. It must be very serious and sad and dour." And I'm like, "Well, it can be that, but something really stupid is going to happen in the game, and the players are going to act in ways that are also stupid, and it's quite a funny game. I mean, I had this experience playing a game of Oath at the end of this very long Office Chronicle. And we were scoring it, and we were also so close to winning. And I was in this intense negotiation, and I literally handed the object that would let a player win the game absent-mindedly to that player because I'd like gotten confused. And it reminded me of this moment when I was a kid and I was playing basketball and I scored on my own team. And it was so funny. And it was the thing that was memorialized. Like, oh, the fool king handed over the crown because he got confused. And I'm like, perfect. That stuff happens in good stories. Like open
The
yourself up to it.
failures are so memorable in your games. Like I remember bad rolls more than good rolls in designs of yours that have been made. And so I think the thing I want most from a game is for it to be memorable
Sure.
and for it to tell stories. And so your games tell stories. So thanks.
I'm very honored to hear that as always. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah. And so, listeners, if you want to talk about any of the stuff that we talked about, there'll be obviously a thread in our Discord. And if you want to become a patron of the show, you'll get access to these episodes early and all that. So, do that. Cole, thanks again. And thanks, as always, to Himbrave for letting us use their song Reach Out as our intro and outro song. And we'll get you next week.
All right.
Bye.
Thanks again.